British soldiers had a complaint about the Bren that you won't hear about any other machine gun of the Second World War. It was, in their own words, too bloody accurate. It also ended up in the wrong hands of the German army in tens of thousands. But how does a gun end up being loved for the wrong reasons and serving the wrong side? In the years before the Second World War, as tensions around the globe escalated, the British Army realized that their best machine guns were still the very same ones from the First World War. The Lewis gun, with that circular magazine slapped on top of what looks like a cannon barrel, weighed almost 30 pounds empty. It was far too complex for mass production on the scale a major war would need. On top of that, the Pan magazine was much slower to reload and not very reliable, especially in battlefield conditions. And with no quick barrel change system, sustained fire was basically out of the question. The Vickers solved the overheating problem with its water cooling system, but that was an old First World War design useful mostly for static defensive positions. It wasn't built for the mobile warfare everyone expected in the coming conflict, especially not when the whole world was now focusing on air-cooled machine guns. So, seeing this situation, they went looking for a new machine gun that would hopefully replace both the Lewis and the Vickers, and competitive trials of many different designs began. The Danish Madsen competed against the American Browning automatic rifle, French Hotchkiss, and British-designed Beardmore Farquhar. The Browning automatic rifle performed better than its competitors, but the problem was its price and Britain's tight post-war budget. They experimented further until something caught their attention. It was the Czechoslovak ZB-26 from the Zbrojovka Brno factory. The Brits began testing it and refining a new model by sending feedback to the Czech factory until the model ZB-30 appeared. This was the first attempt to make this weapon in a British caliber, chambered in the famous .303. Because of the rimmed ammunition, the 30-round magazine got that distinctive curve. This was quite a problem at first. The original version was chambered in the rimless German .792 caliber, so the cartridges sat neatly on top of one another in a straight box magazine. But that was eventually solved, after some engineering headaches. More experienced soldiers learned to load 27 or 28 rounds instead of 30, so the spring in the magazine wasn't under full tension, which reduced the risk of feeding issues. You see, because the .303 was a rimmed cartridge, loading the magazine was a precise job. Each round had to be loaded so its rim sat in front of the previous cartridge's rim. Otherwise, you'd get what was called rim lock, and the magazine wouldn't feed properly. There was some further refinement through the testing phase, and soon prototypes were torture-tested, firing over 140,000 rounds. The recoil springs broke multiple times, but nobody even noticed until the testing stopped for routine cleaning. The gun just kept running with broken springs. The lower receiver actually cracked, and even that didn't stop the gun. The design won decisively over the rival Vickers Berthier and went into licensed production in Britain, with the British paying £3 to the Brno factory for every gun produced. And if you wonder how the Bren got its name, it is BR for Brno and EN for the Enfield factory. So you get the Bren. The more you know. First units rolled off the assembly line in late 1937. But before we go into combat, let's quickly describe the Bren itself, so you'd understand what it did once the war began. The Bren Mark I weighed 22 pounds with a cyclic rate of fire ranging from 480 to 540 rounds per minute. For sustained fire, when you take into account magazine reloading and barrel swaps, that came down to around 120 rounds per minute. It was mostly meant to be fired from a bipod, while a tripod was issued with every third gun. The gun operated on a gas piston system, which could easily be adjusted for anything from desert conditions to Arctic cold. So whether you were fighting in -50 or +50 degrees Celsius, the gun would work just the same. The quick change barrel system was simple, with a release catch in front of the magazine which you'd rotate to unlock the barrel. Then you'd grab it by the carrying handle so you wouldn't need gloves or asbestos cloth to touch the scorching metal, and just slide it forward out of the receiver. A trained crew could swap the barrel in as little as 2 or 3 seconds, and soldiers were trained to change it after firing 10 magazines. Sights were offset to the left of the receiver because of that top-mounted magazine. Okay, so it's September 1st, 1939, and Germany has just invaded Poland. At this point, the British had some 30,000 Brens issued to their soldiers, thinking they had an impressive number of light machine guns for the time. but they were now about to be proven completely wrong in one of the biggest military disasters ever. The British Expeditionary Force was deployed in France, and the Bren, of course, went with them for its first taste of combat. But instead of going on the offensive, Bren gunners found themselves covering one retreat after another as the Germans, with their blitzkrieg tactics, just crushed everything in their path. British forces were frantically retreating to England, trying to save themselves from an enemy who'd been preparing for years. 30 miles from Dunkirk, the Royal Scots were ordered to face and slow down the German SS Totenkopf division to buy time for the evacuation of the main force. They were sacrificed and ordered to fight to the last man, which is pretty much what they did. The fighting became so bad that battalion commanders picked up Brens from fallen gunners and held the line until they themselves were killed. The Bren was inflicting heavy losses on the Germans, who were just trying to obliterate British forces, but nothing could really stop them. The Scots were just buying time. The fall of France was a catastrophe for the British military ego, but more importantly, a catastrophe for equipment. Out of those 30,000 Brens manufactured, only a little over 2,000 returned to Britain after the infamous Dunkirk evacuation, where British forces barely escaped complete annihilation. But to do so, they had to leave most of their gear behind. And now, as the enemy was literally at the gates and everything pointed to an impending invasion of the British mainland, they were scrambling to arm themselves for the upcoming fight. This led to the creation of what they called the Garage Hands Gun. These were improvised or simplified versions of the Bren and other guns that could be produced in an emergency in significant numbers, to arm troops who had nothing to fight with. This is how the Sten gun was born, by the way, one of, if not the cheapest submachine gun of the war. But as the Battle of Britain was slowly won and the threat of invasion faded, normal Bren production picked back up rapidly. Tens of thousands of Bren Mark II, a simplified version that cut the cost by 25%, rolled off the lines. They would soon be heading to North Africa, but in the meantime, something strange happened. After Dunkirk, the Germans looked at the captured British machine guns, and they actually loved them. They designated it as Light Machine Gun MG138E. with E standing for English origin. They printed manuals for their soldiers, and Brens were widely used, mostly to occupation units, coastal defense forces, and anti-partisan units. The Germans were already familiar with the design because, if you remember, the Czechs created the first version of this machine gun chambered in the German 7.92 Mauser cartridge. The Germans had captured Czech factories and continued to produce those weapons for the Wehrmacht. So this gun family ended up being one of the most important foreign designs in German service. It saw quite a lot of use in German hands before the MG34 and later MG42 production caught up. But while the MG34 was a highly precise, delicate weapon that struggled to work in dirty battlefield conditions, soldiers fell in love with the Bren design that would fire wherever you put it. Now, as for the British, their infantry section consisted of 8 men. You had the section commander, 1 Bren gunner and his assistant, and 5 riflemen. Each of those riflemen carried 2 Bren magazines on top of their own rifle ammunition. The assistant was the one reloading the weapon and carried 6 magazines along with the spare barrel. And all of them were trained to use the gun so they could take over if, or rather when, the designated gunner was killed. It wasn't unusual for the squad to carry over 30 magazines, so you see how much they appreciated its automatic fire. And here is the first important thing soldiers learned about the Bren when they were deployed to fight the Germans in North Africa. It was accurate. Besides working perfectly in the desert, which couldn't be said for many other weapons, the Bren could place its shots with remarkable precision. Its lower rate of fire kept bursts grouped much tighter. The gas-operated mechanism pushed everything backward and forward in a straight line with no side-to-side movement that would throw off your aim. And the adjustable bipod, combined with the well-placed pistol grip and carrying handle for additional support, gave the gunner excellent control. So in the hands of a skilled shooter, a Bren could fire a single burst of 5 rounds with almost the same tight grouping as 5 aimed single shots. It was very effective at silencing or suppressing German machine gun nests to allow infantry to advance. Bren gunners would fire tight 3 to 5 round bursts around the heads of the German machine gun team while other soldiers moved up. The British came up with infantry tactics that they called 1 foot on the ground. One group moved while the other provided covering fire, then they alternated. So the Bren group would suppress the enemy while the rifle group maneuvered forward. Then the rifle group would provide covering fire while the Bren group moved to a better position. Soldiers joked that it was too bloody accurate for a machine gun. Because it was so precise, it wasn't as effective at mowing down massed infantry attacks. Other machine guns would create a cone of fire, hitting more targets across a wider area. Brens were also used in an anti-aircraft role on a tripod with the Vickers Motley Pan 100-round drum magazine and spider sights. A little fun fact, the Bren had a small metal stud on the butt that was only needed to lock the gun into anti-aircraft mounts. But the factory kept manufacturing that stud on spare parts until 1976, decades after anyone had stopped using those mounts and the Bren in the anti-aircraft role. It looks like nobody had bothered to update the production list. By the way, during the Dieppe raid, these 100-round drums were tried out for the first time in battle. They failed horribly, like basically everything else for the British on that raid, and got many Bren gunners killed because the drums jammed at the worst possible moment. Now, this video couldn't go without mentioning the so-called Bren carrier, which was actually called, correctly, the Universal Carrier. But anyway, they built about 113,000 of them across all variants, making it the most produced armored fighting vehicle in history. Early models had the Bren mounted to a bracket, but later versions simply rested the gun on a rubber block in the weapons slot, so the gunner could dismount quickly and bring the machine gun with him. And besides the standard Bren mounting, carriers were modified to take Boy's anti-tank rifles, Vickers heavy machine guns, mortars, PI-80 launchers, or even 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns on American-built versions. There was even the Wasp flamethrower variant. And when you give the Bren machine gun to a soldier like Corporal Thomas Peck Hunter, you get the incredible but sad story that this video couldn't go without. In April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered, a 21-year-old Royal Marine Commando and his unit were attacking German positions in northern Italy. The problem was that the Germans had set up a defensive line with 9 machine guns and mortars, all covering about 200 yards of completely open ground. Hunter grabbed his Bren and just sprinted across that open stretch, firing from the hip, while the Germans opened fire on him from all directions. He reloaded on the move, made it to the German positions, then cleared out a couple of houses by himself, and even captured 6 German soldiers. But then his troop got pinned down trying to follow him across, so Hunter climbed onto a pile of rubble and deliberately made himself a target. Firing his Bren, he drew German fire onto himself so his men could get moving. He kept firing until he was hit in the head by German machine gun fire. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for this action. As for the Bren, the end of World War II didn't mean the end of its service. When Britain adopted the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge in the 1950s, they had a choice to make. They could either develop an entirely new light machine gun or convert the existing Bren inventory. And because conversion was more cost-effective, the L4 light machine gun was eventually born and entered service in 1955. That curved magazine was no longer necessary with rimless ammunition, so it was replaced by a nearly straight 30-round magazine. Only a few thousand L4 series weapons were produced before the belt-fed FN mag replaced them in the sustained fire support role.